Hi friends, Father Kerry Walters here, pastor of Holy Spirit American National Catholic Church. This is another Holy Spirit moment. This one on Mourning at God's Funeral, which is the first of a three-part series on post-Christianity. What we used to call Christendom is dead as a doornail. By Christendom, we meant Christianity as a social, political, and economic institution, one of the world powers. That probably died toward the end of the Renaissance. But what is also the case, my friends, is that we are, I believe, living now at the beginning of a post-Christian ethos. It is clearly the case that at least in the English-speaking world, adherence to Christianity is on the wane. In England, for example, only 38% of the population identifies as Christian. In Australia, 43%. Canada, 63% and falling. And in the United States, which still claims to be a Christian nation, only 64% of adults claim the title of Christian. Just last week, the Pew Foundation, one of the most reputable ones in the country, predicted that by the year 2070, fewer than half of American adults will claim to be Christian. They estimate that only between 35 and 46% of people will claim adherence to the faith. So at least in the English-speaking world, we have entered into the post-Christianity ethos. This ethos is not at all unlike what Thomas Kuhn once called a paradigm shift when it came to the rise and fall of scientific models. Thomas Kuhn argues that when sciences are replaced, what is the consequence is a total shift in the way of looking at the scientific material model. I think that there is a paradigm shift going on here when it comes to meaning. Christianity, of course, provided the Western world, at any rate, with a deep sense of transcendent meaning, a deep sense of purposefulness for 2,000 years. But now the paradigm is beginning to wane, and we have yet to understand what will replace it, because we are still in the midst of the paradigm shift. The paradigm shift has been going on for a while. These things move slowly. It probably began in the 16th century with the rise of what we today would call science. The 18th century Enlightenment certainly pushed it along at a robust pace. In the 19th century, as early as 1851, we see that there is widespread questioning about Christianity. I think it's been beautifully captured in that haunting, evocative poem, Dover Beach, by Matthew Arnold, which he wrote in 1851 and didn't publish until about 6 years later, in which he imagines himself standing on a beach, looking at the tide going out and seeing the tide as a metaphor for Christian faith. Christian faith is on the ebb tide. Of course, in that same decade of the 19th century, Charles Darwin's Origin of Species is published, which even further casts doubt upon Christianity. In 1882, Friedrich Nietzsche, I believe, beautifully summed up the shift, the movement in our ethos in his book, The Gay Science. Paragraph 125 of that book famously proclaims the death of God. A madman with a lit lantern is searching the streets at high noon. And when people ask him, "What are you looking for?" he says, "I'm looking for God. God is missing." And they begin to mock him. And finally, in exasperation and anger, he throws the lantern on the ground and he points to a church in the distance and he says, "I'll tell you where God is, over there. That's God's tomb. That's God's sepulcher. God is dead and you and I have killed him." Now, of course, what Nietzsche is trying to express with this parable is that belief in God is slowly dying away, and that God is being killed, metaphorically speaking, by our indifference, by our neglect, by our attitude of increasing secularity, by our increasing lowering of the transcendent meaning which the world had come to rely upon for, up to that point, some 19 centuries. Now, some people, of course, then and now welcome the death of God. They see it as an exuberant opportunity for coming into their own as human beings. But others are flummoxed by it then and now because they feel that the ground has been swept out from under their feet. Even if they can't quite articulate to themselves why they have this sense of uneasiness, they do suspect that it has something to do with the fact that old understandings of what constitutes purpose and meaning have now somehow been called into question. We are all mourners at God's funeral these days, my friends. Some of us are indifferent and are simply spectators. Others of us are perhaps even gleeful, glad that the old man is gone and that we are now out from under his thumb. But most of us, I suspect, feel a dis-ease, a kind of quiet desperation, as Henry David Thoreau would have put it. And these mourners at God's funeral have been represented over and over and over again in the fine arts, in literature, in cinema, in philosophy, in sociology. I would just like to mention a handful of them to give you a better idea of what I think it is that all of us who are flummoxed by the death of God might be experiencing these days. It seems to me that it's quite reasonable to begin with the French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, who was born in 1905. Sartre was one of those who, on the one hand, celebrated the death of God because he believed that the death of God frees us. But on the other hand, he also claims that the death of God brings in its wake a sense of dread, a sense of uncertainty, that even though we're now absolutely free, we fear that freedom and we try to avoid it by turning ourselves into unfree objects. In addition to Sartre's uneasiness at God's funeral, you have the uneasiness that the playwright Samuel Beckett writes about in his drama. Beckett was born the year after Sartre in 1906. All of us are familiar with Beckett's famous play, Waiting for Godot, with Godot, of course, being a pretty transparent allusion to God. Yes, the overwhelming message of that particular play is futility. In a universe that is bereft of God, the landscape is barren and searless and unwelcoming, and you and I are doomed to a kind of stasis in which no action makes any sense, and the future seems not to hold anything that could bring us hope. We have this abiding sense of futility. As the two characters in the play, Vladimir and Estragon, constantly say to one another, "We're not waiting anymore, let's go!" And they wait some more. Or consider W.H. Auden, the American-British poet, born in 1907, in a book-length poem of his entitled The Age of Anxiety. He presents us with four characters who are sitting drinking at a bar, and they begin to talk about their lives. And as they do, the reader very quickly comes to see that all of them, in one way or another, is almost paralyzed by a sense of insecurity, a sense of anxiety, a sense of foreboding. As a matter of fact, one of the lines in the book is a riff on the beginning of Dante's Divine Comedy, when Dante tells us that in midlife he found himself lost in a wood. These four characters, Auden tells us, are likewise lost in a dark place in midlife. So we've got dread, we've got a sense of futility, and we've got a sense of deep, abiding anxiety that at least these mourners at God's funeral are experiencing, and I suspect many of us are experiencing. And all of that can be summed up very nicely, I believe, by Albert Camus, who was born in 1913, and his understanding of the absurd. What Camus says is this: the absurd is his label, his name, for this sorry fact that even though we no longer believe in deep purpose or deep meaning, even though we no longer hope for transcendent meaning beyond ourselves, we still long for it. That's the absurdity, that we long for that which it is impossible to achieve, that we have this craving or this hunger inside of us that can never be filled. Why? As Nietzsche said, because the source of that craving, that which can fulfill it, is no longer really believed in. We are at God's funeral. So what we've got then, my friends, in the post-Christian society, in the post-Christian ethos, is an abiding sense of directionlessness, an abiding sense of futility, an abiding sense that there is no place home. There is no place in which we can search, in which we will find that for which we deeply, deeply yearn: meaning, purposefulness, transcendence. And there's one other thing, it seems to me, that we mourners at God's funeral have to contend with. And Nietzsche said it well back in 1882 with the publication of The Gay Science, in that same paragraph in which he talks about the madman searching with a lantern for God. The madman, after he dashes the lantern on the ground and tells people that God is dead, then says this: "Who will be able to forgive us for this sin? Who will wash away the blood guilt from us? We have slain the only possible source of forgiveness, God, for such a horrible crime, deicide." So in addition to futility and anxiety, in addition to this hunger that can never be filled, in addition to the dread of freedom that we now experience, we have an underlying, almost queasy sense that we somehow are responsible for the sorry state of affairs in which we find ourselves. The post-Christian ethos in which we dwell is one that brings all of these emotions and responses to the table. In part 2 of this series, we will examine exactly what happens as a consequence of this anxiety and uneasiness and sense of futility. What will replace the transcendence which we can no longer believe in? What will sustain the post-Christian ethos? Because after all, nature abhors a vacuum. So what will rush into the place of the Christianity that an increasing number of people no longer can embrace? I'm Father Kerry Walters, and this has been another Holy Spirit moment. Thank you, and if you are of a mind to subscribe, I invite you to do so. I'll see you soon.